what do we mean, or what comes into diversity and inclusion? That's number one. And then how do you see, some of that having an implication for our generation, the Gen Z generation, right? The youngest of the generation who will be coming into the workforce.
So, Nikhil, you're completely right. When I started on this journey, when I worked for Baxter and I came out of it, I only thought gender was the only thing that needed consideration. But how naive I was, and with my little experience that I worked, I realized it's so much more than that. Gender will always be important because it cuts through almost 50% of the population. So that's a huge number that you cannot miss. But I think diversity is largely about experience.
Hmm.
It's about education. It's about generations. It's about, I think, in countries like India or even any parts of the world where countries are diverse, it's also about people who are in tier one cities versus people who are in tier two cities. Their upbringing is different. What they bring to the table is different. Their exposure is different, and making sure they get the right exposure in organizations is important. Of course, no one's taking away. We're talking about race. Persons with differential ability. We're talking about the LGBTQAI. So I think it's the entire gamut that needs consideration and conversations. And I think organizations and world over, we're evolving to that stage. Are we there yet? Probably not, because these conversations have just started. But I think that's what work of you and I through this podcast is, to have a conversation reach places.
Yeah, excellent. Now, Kanika, you work with a lot of firms in your consulting practice. What are the kind of things are you seeing? In other words, what are companies doing? What should they be doing? And so, what's the landscape like? And what, tell us, like, what are you seeing?
But this, Nikhil, can I answer the second question
Oh,
now?
yes, I'm so sorry. Please, yes.
So would you like to ask me that question?
Yeah, the first question that we spoke was about, of course, trying to understand the DNI, and then, of course, the implications on Gen Z. So yes, so you explained to us. Now tell us the implications on the Gen Z.
Before I get into Gen Z, one thing I'd like to begin with is to say I genuinely believe inclusion begins with an I, and the I stands for I, which
Hmm.
means I need to be really, be feeling included in an organization. Now, when we typically talk about Generation Z, as on today, there could be a little less in numbers as compared to the other generations who are possibly at work. I know this landscape will change in years to come. And because they are lesser in numbers and they could have been joining organizations in the last few times, it could mean that they probably could be working as an individual contributor somewhere lower in the rung. They could be working as a silo, or maybe just as a tech expert. And especially with the pandemic coming in, I think a lot of people who've joined us in the last 2, 3 years haven't had the feeling to understand the culture of the entire organization, because culture is not what you see through a Zoom meeting.
Hmm.
Culture is what you see on the cafeteria in our organization. So I think from their perspective, how organization embrace them and bring them to speed is really important. A lot of them could have been onboarded and have never even met the team. So it's less likely that they feel included at all, or they are able to include others. I think I often say this, inclusion is a two-way street. You include me and I include you, or I'm worthy
Hmm.
of being included. So I think it goes both ways. I think a lot of Gen Z joining in need to understand perspective. So, for example, if you work in a startup, then maybe understanding the perspective of it is really easy. But if you're working in a very large corporations, sometimes getting to understand perspective can really be important. And I think the last thing about this is, this entire concept of ageism, and I was talking to a client the other day and I said, really authentically inclusive organizations engage the entire spectrum of age.
Hmm.
And I think that kind of stood back with my client. And I think that is what Generation Zs need to be helped with. And as we go along, probably we'll talk more about it.